feel, right? But moving from the right lectern to the left lectern is throwing me off completely. The whole world is, but it does feel that way sometimes. If you ask Josie about it, she'll tell you that there's a ghost here somewhere in the building, and that's why she would always freaked out if she was left here late at night and Bob would have to stay with her. And I've been here pretty late at night on a few occasions, especially recently. I once found an owl living here, actually. That was the most amazing thing. I walked into the chapel and there was literally a beautiful owl, saw me and just booked it. So, that might be what Josie was worried about all these years. Might just be, But it's an amazing building. And, my one big regret for the holidays was that I couldn't get the organ figured out. That was the one thing. Like, we had an opportunity first time ever to have like a legit usage of the organ, and the organ works and all that, but what I couldn't figure out how to do was to mic it properly without like blowing out everybody's eardrums. I was thank you. I promise, it's not a fishing compliments evening. You don't, but I appreciate it very much. I don't know. It's an interesting holidays for sure. It was really interesting. But as I was just saying, being able to work with somebody like Lauren, makes the experience. And we've been very lucky. We've had some amazing, amazing cantors, and I love them all, and they're all, uniquely wonderful. But, she just she makes it look easy, and she'll be the first one to tell you that she's nervous, about all this stuff. But if you watch like the tape of it, right, not a single one of you would assume that she was nervous about anything, right? You remember my early days. You know what nervousness looks like. It was definitely not that. To have that kind of poise as a third-year cantorial student is crazy. I like that. It really was a very surreal experience, though, when you walk into a church and all of a sudden there's an owl there. I don't know what the symbolism could potentially be, but yes, definitely better than that. That was my first assumption. Once you hear wings at night, that's usually your first guess. Yeah. Was it that? No. Oh, are you kidding? Susie the stalwart. You were like, one of the people clamoring for in-person stuff again. You're our stalwart. You're here all the time. Yeah. Anyway, how you doing? Jack, how you doing? Steve, good to see you. Sei gesund? Thank you. Sorry about the Giants game, though. Look, some things have to remain the same from year to year, right? If all of a sudden the Giants got good, then last night was they were particularly painful last night, though. They're a unique team, right? And I was born in 1981, so I've seen them win Super Bowls in every generation, and they can win in the most spectacular fashion imaginable, miraculous even, right? Miraculous, and then they can lose in the most unique and special kinds of ways, right? The kinds of ways that just I was gonna say in the 80s that was what yeah. Yep. Smarter man than I to walk away. See, that's the thing. I'm the one that goes down with the plane, to the last. And last night was the last minute one of these things. It's just, I'm like half comatose from Yom Kippur, and I'm still watching this game. All right. Well, Shabbat Shalom, everybody. As you'll notice, Cantor Lauren is getting a very well-deserved, well-earned couple of weeks off, so you're stuck with just me and Keelan. Which is nice. And well, Marcia, you'll appreciate this part of it, which is that I don't know most of the melodies that Cantor Lauren knows, so we're going to go back to some of our tried and true. Yeah, okay, let's not get over-enthusiastic about it. Here's the rub, though, is that with Keelan and I, we haven't done this in a long time, so, we may be a little off at a couple of places, but we're going to do our very best to remember some of our classic melodies. Why don't we do our warm-up melody first, and then I'll do candles. Let's see how we do with that one, and then we'll go. See? Shabbat Shalom, everyone. Shana Tova. All right, I think we're doing all right for like more than a year of not having done. I think it's pretty good. So a couple things to just say up front, as has become an annual tradition on the Shabbat right after Yom Kippur, when the rabbi has given all of the sermons that the rabbi is capable of giving for a week or two. We do an Ask the Rabbi session during the sermon period. So I realize after years of telling you on the spot, it's better to tell you at the beginning. That way, if you have questions, they can have time to percolate. Just try and ask me things that I might at least have a reasonable chance of answering, and I'll do my very best. The second is I'm realizing, again, in some amount of sleeplessness, that I forgot to get the Kaddish lists and stuff from Eileen's office. So during the Amidah, I'm going to peek out and go grab them, so I don't want you to worry that I'm running away from you or anything like that. All right? I think that those are all my instructions for tonight. The emergency exits can be located on either side as well. We're going to turn to page 120 as we light and bless our Shabbat candle. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu lehadlik ner shel Shabbat. All right, we'll turn now to page 130 as we begin Kabbalat Shabbat together at the top of the page, and we'll go with whatever melody comes out of Keelan. That's what we're singing. Lechu neranena, lechu neranena, lechu neranena, l'Adonai. Lechu neranena, lechu neranena, lechu neranena, l'Adonai. Naria, naria, letzoi shenu nekadma fana vetoda. Naria, naria, letzoi shenu bizmirot naria lo. Lechu neranena, lechu neranena, lechu neranena, l'Adonai. Lechu neranena, lechu neranena, lechu neranena, l'Adonai. Turn now to Psalm 96 on page 131. Shiru l'Adonai, shiru shir chadash, shiru l'Adonai kol haaretz, shiru l'Adonai baruchu shemo, basru meyom leyom yeshuato, shiru l'Adonai baruchu shemo, basru meyom leyom yeshuato, shiru l'Adonai, shiru shir chadash, shiru l'Adonai kol haaretz, shiru l'Adonai baruchu shemo, basru meyom leyom yeshuato, shiru l'Adonai baruchu shemo, basru meyom leyom yeshuato. Turn now to page 132 at the very bottom of the page. Orzaru ala tzadi uleishrei lev simcha. Orzaru ala tzadi ולאשרי לב שמחה. אור זרוע לצדיק ולאשרי לב שמחה. אור זרוע לצדיק ולאשרי לב שמחה. Turn now to page 134, the very top. Zamru l'Adonai bechinor b'kol zimra b'chatzotrot b'kol shofar. Ariu lifnei hamelech Adonai, Hiram hayam umlo, Tevel veyoshvei ba, Neharot imcha uchav yachad Harim Yeranenu Lifnei Adonai Kiva Lishpot Haaretz Yishpot Tevel Betzedek Behamim Memesharim Hiram hayam umlo Tevel veyoshvei ba Neharot imcha uchav yachad harim yeranenu. Now on page 135, the last Hebrew paragraph in the middle of the page, Romamu. Romemu Adonai Eloheinu ve'ishtachavu le'ar kodsho. Romemu Adonai Eloheinu ve'ishtachavu le'ar kodsho ki kadosh Adonai Eloheinu romemu ki kadosh Adonai Eloheinu romemu Adonai Eloheinu ve'ishtachavu le'ar kodsho. Romemu Adonai Eloheinu ve'ishtachavu le'ar kodsho. Turn now to page 136, if you remember this melody. Mizmor leDavid, Avul Adonai b'nei Elim, Avul Adonai kavod va'oz, Avul Adonai kevod shemo, Ishtachavu l'Adonai behadrat kodesh, Kol Adonai hamayim, El hakavod hirim, Adonai al mahayim rabim, Adonai al mahayim rabim. Kol Adonai ba'koach, Kol Adonai behadar, Kol Adonai shover harazim, Vaishaber Adonai et arzei halbanon, Vayakidehem kemo egel, Levanon ve'Siryon, kemo כמו בן רעים, כמו בן רעים. כל אדוני חוצב להבות אש, כל אדוני יכיל מדבר, יכיל אדוני מדבר קדש, כל אדוני יחולל איילות, ויחשוף יערות ובחלו, כולו מרכבות, כולו מרכבות, כולו מרכבות. אדוני למבול ישב, וישב אדוני מלך לעולם, אדוני עוז לעמו ייתן, אדוני יברך את עמו בשלום. So we're going to turn now to page 138 for Lechado D, and Keelan, maybe do you remember how to do the exact way we used to, and then we'll do the switch at I think it's the fifth one? Remember it?
I'll keep an eye.
Okay, we'll give it a shot. We'll do all the paragraphs this week. We'll give it a shot. Okay. Lecha dodi likrat kala, penei Shabbat nekabela. 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 Shamor וזכור בדיבור אחד, השמיענו אל המיוחד, אדוני אחד ושמו אחד, לשם ולתפארת ולתהילה. lecha dodi likrat kala, penei Shabbat nekabela. Lecha dodi likrat kala, penei Shabbat nekabela. Likrat Shabbat lechu v'nelcha, ki hi mekor haberacha, merosh mikedem nesucha, sof maaseh b'machshava tchila. Lecha dodi likrat kala, penei Shabbat nekabela. Lecha dodi likrat kala, penei Shabbat nekabela. Mikdash melech ir melucha, kumitzei mitof hafecha, rav lach shevet be'emek habacha, vehu yachmol alayich chemla. Lecha dodi likrat kala, penei Shabbat nekabela. Lecha dodi likrat kala, penei Shabbat nekabela. Itnari me'afar kumi, livshi bigdei tifartecha mi, ahal yad ben Yishai beit halachmi, korva el nafshi ge'ala. Lecha dodi likrat kala, penei Shabbat nekabela. Lecha dodi likrat kala, penei Shabbat nekabela. Hitoreri, Iva orech kumi uri, 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 shir daberi, kevod Adonai alayich nigla. Lecha dodi likrat kala, Penei Shabbat nekabela. Lecha dodi likrat kala, Penei Shabbat nekabela. Lecha dodi likrat kala, Penei Shabbat nekabela. Lo tevoshi velo tikami ma tishtachachi uma tehemi bach yechesu aniye ami benivneta iralti la lecha dodi likrat kala benei Shabbat nekabela ve'ayu leshimso shosaich verachaku kol mevalai Yasis alaich Elohai Yimsos Chatan Akala Alecha Dodi Likrat Kala Penei Shabbat Nekabela Yaminu Smol Tifrotzi Ve'et Adonai Ta'aritzi Al Yadish Ben Partzi Ben Ismecha Venagila lecha dodi likrat kala penei Shabbat nekabela boi veshalom ateret balagam besimcha ובצהול התוכם עם סגולה בואי חלה לך דודי לקראת קלה בני שבת לקבלה יאי לי 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 יאי לה 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 לי 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 ay la 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 ay la la ya la 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 ya la la ya la 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 lecha dodi likrat kala penei Shabbat nekabela. So this probably needs a little bit of explanation because it's been so long since we've really done this. So we have some new members in the room who've probably never seen this before. So before COVID times, which seems like a long time ago, in our beautiful temple, when we get to that part of Lecha Dodi, it would actually be dancing in the aisles and in some cases even out into the social hall and then back in around. And, you know, it's something that obviously, there are a lot of things that I miss from those days. It's one of the very, very tops of them. To see you guys, you know, especially those that have been doing it for years before I even got here, it was a very sweet moment. I'm sorry that everybody who's watching couldn't see it. The camera doesn't pick up all that. But just imagine everybody or the you know, stalwarts standing in their places and dancing. And it's very sweet, guys. It's really very sweet. Also, credit to Keelan again for being able to remember all this stuff as it goes. All right, so we're going to turn now to page 140. And again, Psalm 92, very top of the page. Tzadi Katamar, actually, towards the bottom. בבית אדוני בחצרות אלוהינו יפריחו הוד ינובון תשנים ורעננים יהיו להגיד כי ישר אדוני צורי ולא הבלטה בו. Chatzi Kaddish on page 144. Yitkadal v'yitkadosh shemei Rabba ve'amad yivrach yirtei ve'amlich malchutei v'chayechonu v'yomechonu chayedechol Beit Yisrael b'hagalaha uvizman kariv ve'imeru Amen. Yeshmei Rabba mevarach le'alam le'al me'almaya yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yitbar v'yitramam v'yitnaseh v'yitadar v'yitalev v'yitalal shemei dekudesha brichu leila min kol birchata v'shirata tush bechata v'nechemata Damiran vehalma veimeru. Amen. We rise in body or spirit as we turn to page 146 for the Baruch Hu. Baruch Hu et Adonai hamevorach. Baruch Adonai hamevorach leolam vahed. Please be seated. Let's turn to page 148. We'll read together in English at the bottom of the page. Blessed are you, Adonai, our God, ruler of the universe, who speaks the evening into being, skillfully opens the gates, thoughtfully alters the time and changes the seasons, and arranges the stars in their heavenly courses according to plan. You are creator of day and night, rolling light away from darkness and darkness from light, transforming day into night and distinguishing one from the other. Adonai Tzvaot is your name. Ever-living God, may you reign continually over us into eternity. Blessed are you, Adonai, who brings on evening. Umavir yom umevi laila, umavdil beyom uvein lahaila, Adonai Tzvaot shemo, El chai v'kayam tamid yimloch aleinu leolam vaed, Baruch atah Adonai, Amari v'arhavim. Let's read together on the top of page 151. As you taught Torah to those whose names I bear, teach me Torah too. Its mystery beckons, yet I struggle with its truth. Did you mean Torah for me? Did you mean the struggle for me too? Don't let me struggle alone. Help me to understand, to be wise, to listen, to know. Lead me into the mystery. Ki hem chayenu ve'orech yameinu, v'hem negei yomav v'lahaila, v'avatcha al tasir mimenu li'olamim, Baruch atah Adonai, Ohev amo Yisrael. Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. Please join me on top of page 154. ואהבת את אדוני אלוהיך בכל לבבך ובכל נפשך ובכל מאודיך, והיו הדברים האלה אשר אנוכי מצווך היום על לבביך, ושיננתם לבניך ודיברת בם, בשבתך בביתך ובלכתך בדרך, ובשוכבך ובקומך, וקשרתם להיות על ידיך, והיו לטוטפות בין עיניך, וכתבתם על מזוזות ביתך ובשעריך, למען תזכרו ועשיתם את כל מצוותי והייתם קדושים לאלוהיכם. אני אדוני אלוהיכם, אשר הוצאתי אתכם מארץ מצרים להיות לכם לאלוהים. אני אדוני אלוהיכם, אדוני אלוהיכם emet. Let's read together on the top of page 157. Standing on the parted shores of history, we still believe what we were taught before ever we stood at Sinai's foot, that wherever we go it is eternally Egypt, that there is a better place, a promised land, that the winding way to that promise passes through the wilderness, that there is no way to get from here to there except by joining hands, marching together. As we turn to page 158, Michamoch. Ya bye bye bim 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 bam, ya bye bye bim bam, ya bye bye bim 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 bam, ya bye bye bim bam, ya bye 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 bye, ya bye bye bim bam, ya bye 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 bye, ya bye bye bim bam. Mi chamocha bailim Adonai, mi chamocha nedar b'kodesh, nor hatehilot osef ele, nor hatehilot osef ele. Ay bye bye bim 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 bam, ya bye bye bim bam. Ay bye bye bim 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 bam, ya bye bye bim bam. Ay bye 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 bye, ya bye bye bim bam. Ay bye 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 bye, ya bye bye bim bam. מלכותך ראו בניך, בוקעם לפני משה ומרים, זה ליענו ואמרו, אדוני ימלוך לעולם ועד. ונאמר, כי פד אדוני את יעקב, וגואלו מיד חזק ממנו, ברוך אתה אדוני, גאל ישראל. Let there be love and understanding among us. Let peace and friendship be our shelter from life's storms. Adonai, help us to walk with good companions, to live with hope in our hearts and eternity in our thoughts, that we may lie down in peace and rise up, waiting to do your will. Hashkiveinu Adonai Eloheinu leshalom, ve'hamidenu shomereinu lechaim. Hashkiveinu Adonai Eloheinu leshalom, ve'hamidenu shomereinu lechaim. Ushmor tzeiteinu uvoeinu lechaim u'shalom me'ata ve'ad olam. Ashkiveinu Adonai Eloheinu leshalom, ve'hamidenu shomereinu lechaim. Blessed are you, Adonai, guardian of Israel, whose shelter of peace is spread over us, over all your people Israel, and over Yerushalayim. B'Shamru, page 162. V'shameru ובני ישראל את השבת לעשות את השבת לדורותם ברית עולם. עין ביני ובין בני ישראל אותי לעולם. כי ששת ימים עשה אדוני את השמיים ואת הארץ, וביום השביעי שבת Shabbat v'yinafash. I'll invite everyone to rise in body or spirit as we begin the Amidah together on page 164, and then as always continue silently, and when you're finished you may be seated. And just a reminder, as I mentioned at the beginning, if you didn't catch it, I left some important papers in the other room, so as soon as I finish my Amidah I'm going to run, go grab them, and I'll come right back, but I'm not leaving you, I promise. Okay, again, we'll begin together, page 164, and then continue silent. Adonai sefatai tikach ufi yagi tehilatecha. Adonai, open up my lips that my mouth may declare your praise. Oseh shalom bimromav, hu yaseh shalom aleinu, ve'al kol Yisrael, ve'al kol yoshvei tevel, yaseh shalom, shalom aleinu, ve'al kol Yisrael, yaseh shalom, shalom aleinu, Ve'al Kol Yisrael. Okay, please be seated. We'll turn now to page 371 as we offer our Mishaberach this evening. We'll begin by thanking those in our community that we know who are in need of healing. Bruce Stager, Chana Ruth Bat Sarah, Jeff Baker, Dave Tosher, Jim Cohn, Monique Renee Banks Rathbun, Lindsay Epstein, Dolores Michka, Sylvia Orn, Yerachmiel Ben Hinda, Paloma Chauhan, Samuel Moskowitz, Chaim Leib, Joyce Weinberg, Rick Gold, Stu Pollack, Jane London, Catherine Guarino, Emunah Chaba, Judy Stern, Miriam Cornfield, Raz Brody, Chana Ruth Bat Sarah, Fagel Tzipora Bat Elisheva Bat Sarah, Richard Gambino, Michelle Sawicki, Idol Basha Bat Yitzchak, Tzvi Menachem Ben Chaim, Rivka Bat Devora, Amy and Gavin Tucker, Janice Kurz, David Dowling, Israel Ben Yitzchak, Ben Sion Ben Moshe, Lorraine Danis, Buddy Kossoff, Shelley Newmark, David Kyle Klopman, Rivka Bat Rachel, Sarah Bat Chana, Moshe Eliezer Ben Sibia, Peretz Ben Yehuda, Leah Bat Naomi, and Gedalia Ben Leah. In addition to the names that we just read, I invite anyone watching at home to mention loved ones at home. And here with us tonight, we'll start on this side of the room and work towards the back, and then this side of the room. So if you have names to share, just please raise a hand so I make sure I see everybody. And we'll join together now on page 371 in the middle of the page. Mi sheberach avoteinu mekor habracha leimotenu. May the source of strength, who blessed the ones before us, help us find the courage to make our lives a blessing, and let us say, Amen. Mi sheberach imotenu mekor habracha lavotenu. Bless those in need of healing with refuah shlema, the renewal of body, the renewal of spirit, and let us say, Amen. Shabbat shalom, everybody. So 2 quick words about my little jaunt to the other room. One is that I think that was the fastest that I've davened the Amidah since when I was a kid. I remember flying to Israel, and if you're on an El Al flight and you're a young Jewish person who looks like they're over 13, then no doubt if you're sleeping doesn't matter. You're going to be woken up, brought to the back of the plane to be part of a minyan at the back of the plane, and everybody davens at about a speed of 1,000,000 words a minute. So, I am capable of those things, but it's from a very recessed part of my brain. So that's one. Second is, you should know that what I did tonight was, you're all very forgiving, but was actually very not okay. In the tradition, it's what's called tircha de tzibura. Tircha is actually one of my dad's favorite words because he occasionally, when he gets upset in a service, he'll just sit in the back and whisper it to himself. Tircha, basically, the idea is that you should never purposely or intentionally burden the congregation. So, for example, you have somebody who's leading the service, and they are loving leading the service, and they're singing slowly and all this stuff, but the rest of the world needs to go to work. That's considered tircha de tzibura. So even if you have a person who's leading and is doing it beautifully, if they're not considering the people who are in the pews, you are what's called a tzibur. You are part of the community of prayers. If we're not considering you guys in the process, it's not a good thing. So you'll forgive me. I know we just passed Yom Kippur, but I ask forgiveness, and I'm sure it's given. But since we're teaching things tonight, I figured you should know that one. And if I'm ever really doing it poorly, you are actually within your rights to stand up and yell tircha at me at some point or another, and then I'll have to adjust accordingly. So this is, as we say, one of my sort of semi-annual favorites. We get to this point of the year every once in a while where the rabbi needs a little bit of a sermonizing break, but I still love to teach, and I in particular love to have an opportunity to be asked questions, because sometimes, right, you have things on your mind, and there isn't always a circumstance to ask it. So I don't know if anybody has any oh, wow, look at this. Okay, we may have to, we'll see how far we get. All right, just to make it easy, we're going to go from front to back, okay? So Neil, you had your hand up. First, we'll go with you. Neil. And I'll try to, for people who are on the stream, I'll ask the question again through the stream. Okay. This is an excellent question, Neil. This is an excellent. Okay, so what Neil asked, if you couldn't hear it, is do I, as a rabbi, think that there is something, let's say, special or elevating about actually standing up at the points of the service in which we stand? So this is, first of all, a fantastic question. And for those that have, before I had to briefly pause teaching it, my class that I teach on Friday mornings, which is about the Siddur, about our prayers, is really about all of the way that we approach prayer and what we would call, in modern terms, ritual choreography, right? When do we stand? When do we sit? When do we do this? When do we do that? And so for most of us, especially if you grew up learning, prayers from just emulating the people around you, most likely you observed what other people were doing and you mimic it, right? Without anybody actually ever telling you, why are we standing here but not standing here? And the great debate, which is always the question behind the question, is about the Shema, for example, or about the mourner's Kaddish, okay? The Amidah is a prayer in its name. La'amod means to stand up. Amidah means the standing prayer, quite literally. So that one, there really isn't any kind of debate about. I had a feeling, you and I, we know each other. I know where we're going. Okay, but other prayers, it's not actually quite so clear. And it's one of the really interesting parts of our liturgical history is to realize that we tend to think of prayer as being a fixed thing, right? Every Jewish person prays the same way, same basic way at all times. That's actually much more of a modern concept than most people realize. The idea of there actually being a single prayer book that represents a large swath of Jewish people is actually a very modern construct. That's literally within the last 150-odd years for the most part. Most of the time, you had a community, and each community had its own, what's called minhag, its own customs around a lot of things. And one of the things that was a minhag was about whether one stands or sits during the Shema, or stands or sits during the mourner's Kaddish. And while we may assume, right, if you grew up in let's just say a poll of hands here. Did the congregation that you grew up in, did you stand for the Shema? Yes? Okay, so but just so you can, about 50% of the room basically said yes, right? And chances are you grew up either in a classical Reform community or something that is similar to it. But that is often the case in Reform communities, classical Reform communities. To this day, the people will stand for the Shema. And actually, when I got here, it was a concern that I guess that had been a tradition with Rabbi Steinberg, which had been changed with Rabbi Morris, and I kept that tradition mostly because that's how I grew up, which is remaining seated. The Kaddish is an even more complicated one, because if you were, for example, you grew up in a conservative community like mine, or an Orthodox community, generally speaking, you only stand up and you only say the Kaddish if you are actually in mourning or observing a yahrzeit. Everyone else remains standing. And I remember the first time that I got to, the first Reform service that I ever really attended consciously was when I got to my first year of rabbinical studies in Israel. So you can imagine, right, my entire life I had no real concept of Reform practice. I was an interloper coming from the conservative movement. And I was shocked when I got to the Kaddish and everybody stood up and everybody said it. And to me, that just felt like, not only that it was wrong, but it was somehow hurtful, which was, of course, absurd. Right? But the way that I was thinking of it was, when you're in mourning, it's a unique period of time in your life, right? Even the yahrzeits, those are unique periods of time in life. If you do it every single time, the question, at least in my mind, is does that diminish when you get to the specific moment itself? So it somewhat comes back to your initial question, Neil, which is, does there something added when we stand to the experience? And the best thing that I can give you as a rationale for why at least the rabbis thought it was important to stand for certain things and sit for others has to do with our imagery in our mind of what we're doing when we pray. Right? So it may be hard for most of us to comprehend this, but we're supposed to imagine ourselves as standing before God when we pray. Okay, so the idea, for example, of certain prayers like the Amidah or when the Torah is taken out or the Ark is open, as a general concept, the rabbis sort of thought these are moments in which if we personified the moment, right, personified the Torah as God or as a king or a queen or something along those lines, our natural instinct would be to rise in reverence to that. Same way that, for example, when we do the national anthem, right, our natural response response is generally to stand up and to even, in many cases, put our hand over our heart. So to some degree, it's an individual answer, right? Whether we feel elevated by the experience of standing or sitting, I can't answer for you or for anybody else. And at this point in my career, in my life, I don't ever get to sit down. So I basically, right, all you guys who are tired at Neila, let me just tell you something. 9 hours straight of standing, right, is a very tough thing for most people to be able to do. And so I actually struggle in some ways because there are times where I wish, right, that I could sit down and I could have the ability to sort of focus and contemplate in that way, and yet I'm standing the whole time. So it's a fascinating question, Neil, and one that I could probably spend an hour answering all the side parts of it. But I will just say that there is always a logic behind the places and the times in which we stand or we bow. Whether everyone is aware of those logics, that's more my responsibility, right? If I'm not teaching it properly, then I'm missing giving you the opportunity to make the connection between why we stand and why it's important. Does that sort of answer some of them? Okay, I look, if I get a shrug, that's good enough. That's good. All right, Steve and Ellen, we'll bounce back to you, Andrea, just so we can move around a little bit. If I only go Fagans tonight, then I'm going to get in a lot of trouble. So, Steve, Ellen, you're husband and wife. You got to beat it out to see who gets to ask. Well, Steve, you're the consummate loving person. Mm-hmm. Right. 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 And, because in essence, right, you made a connection to that prayer in a way that feels, as you said, right, to show the prayer the proper respect and due, right, to stand. And you are welcome to do it because it's a personal minhag. And every once in a while, the personal minhag and the minhag of a community are not necessarily in alignment. And so there are thoughts on that by the rabbis as to what's, appropriate to do and what's not appropriate. But basically, if you do something that is for yourself, there's nothing wrong with that. If you were to, for example, try to force everybody around you to shift their minhag to meet yours, that would be problematic. So in essence, right, by choosing that that's a prayer where you feel most connected to it by standing is wonderful. And in fact, after we talk about it tonight, you never know, right? You might have a couple other people who are popping up. But it certainly doesn't, have any negative effect on anybody else. But I will just throw one wrinkle into the scenario. So I think it was last Shabbat where I was talking to you guys about what's called Hakel, which is the basis for public Torah readings. It was from our portion last week. Bonus points if anybody remembers. So the description is that the king is meant to read the section of Deuteronomy. But interestingly enough, right, the tradition was for the king to be seated and everybody else to be standing. And it's the inverse of what we would think, right? We would think normally somebody who's reading from the Torah should be standing, everybody else is sitting. And the logic of it was that in the ancient world, right, and it's probably still true in any place where there's still a monarchy, right, the king or the queen sits, the servants stand, right? The people who are attending are the ones who are standing, and the person who is at the highest level is the one who's seated. There is another analog to this, which is when we get to Passover, when we get to the Seder. So you may recall that, in every Haggadah there's usually some explanation of the fact that the rabbis, in attempting to pick up on what it felt like to be a free person, used the image in particular of like the most affluent people of their time, which were the most affluent Romans, right? And the Romans, who would basically, right, sit and recline to the side on comfortable cushions while the servants would feed them grapes, as you remember from all those, pictures on the sides of a broken pottery, right? That was their image in their mind. And so there is this idea also, right, of a certain amount of reverence for sitting, right? We shouldn't think automatically that standing is better than sitting. It's not about that. It's just simply that there are times in which we stand up and times in which we remain seated. And each of those times is designated for a reason and a purpose. But the long answer to that is simply to say that keep standing for Oseh Shalom. It's beautiful, okay? Yeah. Oh, all right, we'll give you a quick... Mm-hmm. I mean, as long as I've known you at the temple, you've been doing it. And I think, so it had to have predated that, and that's quite some time. Very much. So Islam is a great example, as is Christianity, right? As religions that, ultimately come from a similar root, being us. A lot of their ritual choreography, if you pay very close attention to it, you will see that there are analogs between all three religions at various places in the service in which there is a tendency for standing or a tendency for moving in cardinal directions, right? All of those things, in essence, are built off of that, right? And Muslims, when they pray, standing and prostrating, right, bowing completely, is a huge part of the experience of prayer, right? That, generally speaking, no matter where you are in the world, a prayer mat and a person and knowing which direction to face in. And basically, that's one of the first things that children are taught in Islam, is that exact choreography. And it involves not just the coming up and going down, but oftentimes things that relate to where a hand is in relation to the heart. And I think the truth is, I don't know the Eastern religions nearly as well, but I suspect that if you were to study Buddhism, Taoism, Shintoism, right, that you will find a tremendous amount of the same kind of logic, different because each culture is different and applies those things culturally differently. But I think all of us are attempting to do something with our bodies to mimic what we're doing with our souls. The Hasidic part of Judaism developed a number of things, like, for example, you may notice, my brother does this, which my dad refers to as Meshuggah Frum, because that's what my great-grandfather would call it, where you hold a Kiddush cup in the open palm of your hand, for example. So this is from a teaching, and a beautiful teaching, and if I remember correctly, a Hasidic teaching. But it's, again, something that was done for a reason that was internal to that particular person that then became, right, their students decided to do it, and so forth. But it usually has to do with quoting a verse from Tanakh in some form or the other. And you may remember with Cantor Jordan, for example, for those of you that were regular Saturday morning comers, if you get to the Ashrei, one of the phrases is Poteach et yadecha, which means opening up your hands. And he would literally go like this in the service itself. And that also is a common custom, a common minhag, depending on where you daven. And there are tons of these kinds of things. And then if just to, go down further down the rabbit's hole, right, if you start talking about, Mizrahi communities or Sephardic communities or, Iraqi communities, Baghdadi communities, right, every Jewish community, you will find all these little nuances in the way in which they do things, from the regular Friday night service to what they do in their homes for Shabbat and so on. It's one of the great, great things that, again, clearly you're giving me too much time. I could talk about these things for hours. But I do see a couple other hands, so we're going to, bounce around. Steve, is it a quick question? Otherwise, we're going to try to mix up with the... Okay. Mm-hmm. Right. Okay. So I'm going to just repeat so Steve asked a multi-part question, right, about the book of Genesis, and in particular the story of Adam and Eve, and the end of the story of Adam and Eve when the tree of knowledge is eaten from and all the things that result from it. So the first question is that what is referred to sometimes as the original sin? So I'll just say that actually is much more of a Christian concept than it is a Jewish concept. There is an understanding that there was instruction given, instruction not followed, and repercussions for it, right? That's our understanding within Judaism as to what ultimately happened. But it's important to understand, right, that when people talk about original sin in that context, it's a much, much deeper theological and much thornier theological point, because it generally, first of all, will place undue responsibility on women forever. There is also a tradition that says that, like, the punishment to Eve was childbirth, right? That the pain of childbirth is the reminder of this, right? These are the kinds of things, like what I was speaking about the other day, that are part of our tradition, which we have to own, but we also have to be very careful of in terms of what kinds of both theological and philosophical things derived from it and continue to be problematic. Well, no. So again, the concept in the Torah is really about knowledge, right? It's right. So, but the point is that the reason why, again, later theologians then talk about the good and evil piece of it, right, is that what is knowledge, right? Knowledge is the capacity to understand the difference between good and evil and to act upon it. So before Adam and Eve do what they do, they have no real autonomy. They basically are beings of creation who function within a world of creation, and they're meant to do what they're meant to do. Once that is broken, right, that initial covenant is broken, then you have basically a new covenant. And the thing to understand is that both in the Torah and in the Midrash, God does indeed eject, right, Adam and Eve from the Garden of Eden and all of the things that result from it, right? And they're told that they're going to have to work for the rest of their lives in order to do all the things that they were able to do, quote unquote, for free. But there's a beautiful midrash that's the basis for Havdalah, actually, that says that first terrifying night when Adam and Eve are outside the garden and they've never experienced darkness or cold or fear before, that's where God ultimately gives the flame that we refer to in Havdalah as a symbol of, right, that even in the darkest moments, right, God will remain. So the thing about it is that, understanding what sin is and understanding responsibility for sin, Judaism has a different understanding of it entirely, really, from Christianity, and I can't really comment so much on Islam. But the main idea of it is to understand that it's not that we are predestined to do things wrong. It's that we, in the end, were given a choice, right? That's what we talked about all day yesterday, right? Choice between good and evil, life and death. And the main concept in Judaism is that if we study and we learn and we acquire our wisdom and the discernment to know what is right from wrong by following the mitzvot, then we will ultimately lead a life that will return us to the Garden of Eden, right? Because that, I'll just say very quickly in 30 seconds, this is one of the things that actually you will find is taken out of a lot of Reform prayer books at a certain point. The idea or a reference to the idea that there is a Garden of Eden that we go to when we die, for the early Reformers was sort of a hard thing for them to wrap their heads around because they were largely humanists in their sort of mentality at the time. They were thinking more about sort of the here and now and less on the idea that there's reward and punishment in the afterlife. But traditionally speaking, the Garden of Eden is really kind of our imagery of what we return to when we pass away. That's our ultimate end. So like, for example, just as a last word, when I chanted the memorial prayer yesterday, right, or when I chanted at any funeral that I do or any memorial that I do, there are words that I add back in that are traditional. They're not in the Reform prayer book or the Rabbi's manual. And they have to do with talking about the Garden of Eden and our return to it. So it's important to understand that it's a very nuanced question, Steve, and one that actually, again, you could probably spend a semester thinking about. So it's excellent. All right, Bonnie, I think we're going to go to you last before I pass out. Marcia, okay, you know what? Here's the thing. Marcia, will you be here tomorrow? Good. Tomorrow, I'm going to answer your question before my drash tomorrow. That's a deal. That's a deal. And you can all watch the video if you want later. Okay, Bonnie, last question. No, it's right. It's great. Okay, so I'm just going to repeat again, condensed form. So Bonnie was asking about the prayer of Kol Nidreh, and the idea that Kol Nidreh really is a prophylactic prayer, right? We're not talking about the year before, we're talking about the year to come. So what we are asking for is that we are telling God basically ahead of time, we are going to break vows to God, and we are asking for forgiveness a priori, right, in advance of the reality that we are going to break those vows. Just out of curiosity, for how many people is that the first time that you ever heard that explanation and it's changed your way of thinking about it? Okay, excellent. Again, half the room, and that's basically what I would have expected. Again, it's part of the problem of trying to teach a service while the service is going on is that a lot of times we don't do it enough. Okay? And Kol Nidreh is probably in the pantheon of Jewish prayers that are misunderstood. It is at the very top of the list precisely because of this idea, right? And most of us tend to think of the fact that what we're saying, right, is we're asking for forgiveness for the things we've already done, okay? And it changes the whole scenario. So part of this is tied to the idea of, right, the word Kol Nidreh, neder is a vow, okay? And the idea of a neder is actually a very, very significant thing in both Jewish religious thought, but also Jewish sort of cultural civic thought as well. When you make a vow, especially one that involves God, and you don't fulfill that vow, it's bad. I'll just put it that way. It's bad news. Okay? It is one of the things that, and especially for our ancestors, you would have avoided with every conceivable means, to the point at which you would cease from making the vow in the first place out of fear of breaking the vow. So Kol Nidreh, which, by the way, is not Torah Sinai, right? It doesn't come from the Torah. It comes from, liturgical writings, and if I remember correctly, is really Middle Ages. So it's not like Kol Nidreh has been around forever. The high priest wasn't doing Kol Nidreh in the temple, I assure you. Okay, it was the creation of a particular time in which there was a great concern about this sort of idea, right? It's like if it gets to the point in which people aren't able to make any kind of vow out of fear for breaking that vow, here we get a certain kind of protective barrier which says we're going to do our very best to uphold, right? We're going to make our best efforts to keep our promises. But in the event that we should fail in that, we don't want to receive the ultimate punishment out of our hubris. And I'll just explain one last piece of it. And some of you, maybe if you grew up in an Orthodox environment, or you have family or friends who are Orthodox, or you interact with an Orthodox person from time to time, very often, right, if they make a promise to you of some sort, right, some kind of guarantee, they will often say the words bli neder immediately after it. Okay, so bli neder in Hebrew means without a vow, right? So in other words, I'm promising you something to the best of my ability as a human being, like I promised, Eva that she'd have pizza for dinner tonight, right? But in the end, I'm being very careful not to say that this is a neder, this is a vow that I'm making before God, because if for some reason I'm not able to fulfill it, which is often the case in business, for example, that's the case, here you have an almost immediate annulment of that possibility. So here's where it gets tricky, and this will be my last word for tonight. Let's take the logic further down the road, right? This is easily a scenario that could be abused, right? It's meant to give us a certain amount of protection, but it's very easy to imagine a scenario in which somebody basically is not trustworthy anymore because they know they have an out, right? That they're basically guaranteed to be forgiven for what they've done. And this actually became a source of a certain kind of anti-Semitism, and it still exists within modern anti-Semitism to some degree too. It's tied into this idea of, who are the Jews loyal to, right? That was the question in a lot of Europe, a lot of the Dreyfus Affair, right? We're all based on this idea of, right, read their prayer book. If you pick up their prayer book, what is it saying, right? Here's a bunch of people who are saying, we're all saying ahead of time that we're going to make vows that we're not going to keep. Okay, so it creates this sort of element from the outside, an assumption that this is some, intentional thing that is done. And of course, like most types of racism, bigotry, sexism, homophobia, whatever it might be, right, someone can cherry pick an idea and then turn it into a polemic. And of course, again, if you were to take, any part of our prayer book or our machzors and take one prayer out of it and try to determine who the Jewish people are based upon one prayer, or to do that to any other kind of people, very likely you will get a very skewed, very limited understanding. But of course, Kol Nidreh is the first prayer of Yom Kippur. Anybody who continued to read the book all the way to the end would understand that this is a people, if anything, is the exact opposite, right? We are hard on ourselves to the point of really almost sort of self-flagellation when it comes to holding ourselves accountable for our behaviors. It's the exact opposite scenario. But Kol Nidreh is not about what we do to each other. Okay, Kol Nidreh is very narrowly focused on what we do to God. And that's really where I think, again, the misunderstanding of the prayer is multiplied. Because if we think about it in those terms, it shifts the entire conversation. Because I think realistically, if we were making vows to God, and we're making lots of them in a given year, we're going to fall short of a lot of them. All right, I'll put it in the I. Okay, I do fall short of a lot of them. And I think knowing that we are forgiven by God for things that we have done wrong is central to our theology, right? That's what yesterday was really all about. Reminding ourselves, right? Every time we do the 13 attributes, Adonai, Adonai, Rachum V'Chanun, that's why. It's to remind ourselves that our God's a compassionate God, despite the fact that we are troubling people sometimes. So with that, Al Regel Echad, those are my best answers. And Marsha, I promise I will answer your question tomorrow. And look, if you guys want more of these periodically, you tell me. I'm happy to do them anytime. I like this kind of teaching. Socratic method is really quite lovely. Okay, with all that said, let's rise and turn to page 586 at the bottom of the page. Aleinu l'shabech. Aleinu l'shabech l'on hakol latet k'duma liotzer preshit shelo asanu k'goyim ha'atzot velo samanu k'mishmetot ha'adama shelo sam chelkeinu kahem legor aleinu k'kol hamonam אנחנו קוראים ומשתחווים ומודים לפני מלך מלכי המלכים הקדוש ברוך הוא ונאמר והיה אדוני למלך על כל הארץ Bayom hahu yeh Adonai echad. Ushemo, Ushemo, Ushemo echad. Now invite those in mourning and those observing yahrzeit to remain standing. Everyone may be seated at this time. We begin by thinking of those who passed in our community in recent months. Sylvia Alderman, Morris Dickstein, Fred Eber, Sandra Furman, Evelyn Gelb, Lucy Gladstone, Arthur Grossman, Elaine Grossman, Phyllis Katz, Jeanette Kopp, Audrey Lubo, Morty Lynn, Jerry Monroe, Harry Olstein, Stephen Jackson Popkin, Daniela Risa Rigg, Geraldine Rosen, Harriet Roth, Jeannie Rubin, Howard Schreier, Dorothy Shupnick, Paul Silver, Marlise Silverberg, Blanche Sklar, Rita Sandra Snyder, Joan Strong Tangzilius, Virginia Tizer, and Ann Weiss. We also mark the yahrzeits that occurred during the last week for Esther Becker, Leonard Bergman, Herbert Beanstock, Norman Cantor, Ray Cohn, Charles Cutler, Herman Eagle, Adela Eisenstadt, Elizabeth Field, Roz Fisher, Jack Genser, Gustav Gruen, Margie Haddad, Haskell Hoffenberg, George Horowitz, Ida Kaplan, Samuel Katz, Stanley Kirshner, Betty Levine, Jeanette Lowe, Rose Auerbach Moskowitz, Bertus Oglensky, Mary Rach, Joseph Scheinert, Sarah Schultz, Dorothy Sizitsky, Bess Sklar, Forrest Stichman, and Lottie Weiss. Is there anyone else who's saying Kaddish tonight that we didn't mention in the meeting? Deborah? George Kirschenbaum? In solidarity with those who are remembering their loved ones, will rise in body or spirit as we turn to page again 598, recite the mourner's Kaddish. Yitkadal v'yitkadash shemei rabbah, be'alma divrach chirutei v'yamlich malchutei, v'chayichon u'vyomechon u'v'chayei d'chol beit Yisrael, b'agala v'zman kariv v'imru amen. Yehei shemei rabbah mebarach le'alam u'le'almei almaya. Yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yitpa'ar v'yitromam v'yitnaseh, v'yithadar v'yit'aleh v'yithalal shemei d'kudsha b'richu. Leila min kol birchata v'shirata, tushbechata v'nechamata, da'amiran be'alma v'imru amen. Yehei shalama rabba min shemaya, v'chayim aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael v'imru amen. Oseh shalom b'mromav, hu yaseh shalom, aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael v'imru amen. Zichronam livracha, may every one of their memories be for a blessing. Okay. Please be seated. And I realized I also forgot to go back to you, Andrew. So if you want to ask me the question after the service, I'll be happy to answer that question. Anybody who wants to stick around and learn. But just a few announcements. First is to join us for services tomorrow, 9:30, live streamed on our website, YouTube, and Facebook. If you'd like to join us in person, we will meet in the chapel, which is just on the other side of this wall. Also, you're welcome to join us for Torah study on Zoom at 12 o'clock. Reminder, on Monday at 11:30, Nina Mitzvah will be meeting. Yes? Nina Mitzvah? Yeah, okay. And then at 3:30, we have our second session of Hebrew School, which is really great. Also, a reminder that the holiday of Sukkot begins Monday evening. So we'll have services live streamed at 6 o'clock on Monday, and then Sukkot morning services live streamed on Tuesday at 10 o'clock. Yeah, so I think what I just made the most sense for this year, because we couldn't use this space, so it'll be like Friday nights before we did in person again. So you just come onto that. If you'd want to watch it on the live stream, though, you can do that on our website, Facebook, or YouTube, whatever. But if you want to be on an actual Zoom like we used to do, you're welcome to do that as well. So that will be for Sukkot, Erev Sukkot service at 6 o'clock. Yeah, and the reason why is just to give enough time for the end of the service for people who want to get home to be on the Zoom. I know it seems crazy, but just a 2-second explanation. When we did Torah study, one of the big parts of it is that we could feed people while we were doing it. And for during COVID, we're not feeding anybody anything. So you can't have people doing Torah study at noon and not give them food. So the logic was we keep that on Zoom, makes it so that everybody can participate, but we need enough time between the end of the service to get home. So there you go. These are the, nobody wants to know how the sausage is made, kosher sausage is made. But this is part of what it is to be a rabbi, is you have to decide this stuff and what kind of egg salad to serve. So just a reminder also, on the back end of Sukkot, right, we have Yantif as well, and part of that is the celebration of Simchat Torah. We're trying to think of something creative to do, so pay attention. We're going to try to figure out some way to be able to do something that is closer to the actual experience of Simchat Torah, because that's a little tricky one of a holiday to make work. But we are building, once again, a little sukkah. let me see if it says here. Okay, it says that it's going to be on the side rear of the old whalers for us to use. So I believe that would be that side of the building, probably. So that's the front of the building. There's a back parking lot there. If you see a booth outside of a structure that looks like a sukkah, it's ours, and you are welcome to use it throughout the holidays. The only thing that we ask is just to be conscientious of the fact that it's really designed only for either an individual or one family, of 5, just to try to keep the chances of any stuff happening. If there's somebody that's waiting that would like to also use it, just be conscious of that and maybe stay, eat a quicker meal or whatever it might be. But as long as it's out there, you're welcome to come and eat in it, be happy. And the plan is that we're going to leave a lulav and etrog set in there as well, so anybody who wants to come by and use it during the week to fulfill the mitzvah, you're more than welcome to do that. And if you have any questions about it during the week, you can let me know. Also, just a reminder, on Thursday at 6 o'clock is the last, at least for the time being, of Alan Levin's really great class on transformation and renewal, reflecting on the high holiday period, which includes the festival of Sukkot. So you do have to register for it. I know those of you that have been in his previous ones, you have to register for each one of the classes separately. So just make sure if you're interested in joining. It's been really great classes, and I think that he's potentially going to continue to teach through the rest of the year with the other holidays as we continue through the calendar. So again, you can jump in at any time. Each class is really its own standalone. And Alan is a wonderful person, and also in the last year and a half of his rabbinical studies at the Aleph program, which is part of the renewal movement. So pretty soon we'll have another rabbi in the congregation, which is cool. I'm not going to make him work, but it's nice to know that he's there. Okay, I think those are all of my details. And again, just a thank you to all of you for being a part of our holidays in one form or the other, and especially those that took the time to write and text during as notes of support. It means a lot. And, God willing, next year we're back in our brand new building and, all together and squished in as we used to be, which, would be really lovely. And a big credit again to Keelan for somehow or another remembering all of our stuff like it was yesterday. That was fun. So we'll be without Cantor Lauren for another week. She deserves a little bit of time and rest, but hopefully I held the place together. Keelan, I don't even remember, what do we do for a closing song? Can we just do Oseh Shalom? Oseh Shalom, that seems like a good way to end. Oseh Shalom Bimromam Uyaseh Shalom Aleinu O Israel Ve'al Kol Yoshvei Tevel Yaseh Shalom, Yaseh Shalom, Shalom Aleinu ve'al Kol Yisrael. Yaseh Shalom, Yaseh Shalom, Shalom Aleinu ve'al Kol Yisrael. We'll rise for Kiddush, and just a reminder, thank you, Bonnie, for reminding me. If you could just bring our prayer books back where Bob and Josie gave them to you in the first place, that would be very helpful. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam b'orei peri hagafen. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'ratzavanu v'shabbat kodsho b'ahabahu v'ratzon inchilhanu zikaron l'maaseh v'reishit. Ki hu yom techila lemikrae kodesh, zecher letziat Mitzrayim, ki v'hanu v'chata, ve'otanu kidashta mikol hamim, ve'shabbat kodshecha, ve'ahava u'ratzon hinchaltanu, baruch atah Adonai, Nekadesh HaShabbat. Amen. Okay. Chaim, Shabbat Shalom, Shabbat Shalom, Shabbat Shalom to everybody. All right. Very good. Now, Andrea, you got a question for me? All right. Steve. that at some point you are redeemed from that, right? And that's built into the theology as well. But I can't defend it to you, right? Because that early concept of that level of fixity, right? Either you do or you don't, is really challenging. Part of the reason why the early reformers took a lot of that away from being really obvious and right in front of you. But if you're like, for example, I know you're reading at the beginning of the book, read this week's Torah portion and next. Okay, if you were looking for a summary of the basic concepts, this is really Moses' last sort of instruction in the form of a poem, basically. And it's along the lines of, right, you are responsible for behavior. And when you do in opposition to God, that is the sort of broad definition of what we would call, right, various words for it in Hebrew, right? But, right, for example, there's a word that's avera, there's a word, and I forgot, you asked another question about nakedness. Right, so this actually came up in one of my teachings for Yom Kippur, right, is that the rabbis equated the voice of a woman as being, as if, like, hearing that, as being like seeing the person naked, right? So nakedness, and actually that comes from a section of the Talmud in which they talk about basically any number of things that equate to seeing a person, and particularly a woman naked, right? Even if you were to see, for example, an exposed thigh, that is the equivalent of seeing the entire person. And it's part of the reason why, right, in our Orthodox world, in the Islamic Orthodox world, and in the rare places in the Christian world that still have that level of control over women, it's the same thing. You see that happen all the time. And it's all based, again, on this idea that, men are incontrollable of their urges. And it's our responsibility somehow or another, but it's somehow the woman's fault, which makes no sense. Oh, yeah. Right, but like, for example, the section that I pulled what I'm teaching from, which is much longer. For example, there's a midrash that talks about when God created Eve, right? God created Eve out of what part of the body? So the description in the midrash, it goes through every part of the body that it could have been done from, and a reason why not, right? Like, don't do it from the mouth, because then she will be a gossip, right? Don't do it from the leg, because, and I'm serious, like to a ridiculous degree. And in the end, they choose the rib because even if one is standing naked, it exposes nothing, right? It's the most, in essence, the most modest part of the body, of the structural piece of the body. And so it basically says that when God was creating a woman, it was to remind her to be modest. So this, again, is a midrash of the rabbis, which is coming from a much later time period than the Torah. And the Torah has no